Thanks for everyone for joining today's seminar, whether you're face-to-face, we've got maybe 10 here in the room or online. So our guest speaker here, Josh Ettinger, is a PhD candidate at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. His research examines how extreme weather events influence climate change attitudes among the public. His work has a very practical edge in that he's looking to elicit evidence-based strategies for effective climate change communication. So Josh is in Australia as a visiting scholar at Monash University Climate Change Communication Research Hub. He'll illuminate us shortly on how Australia's extreme weather events fit into his PhD research, perhaps including his impressions of visiting Kangaroo Island over the last few days, where he's been looking at the aftermath of the 2025 bushfires. Although, you know, maybe if you want to segue into looking at floods, there's a lot of opportunities to do that at the moment. Just for those who missed reading Josh's bio in the seminar flyer, I'll just add that he's previously worked in several science communication roles at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and the Global Canopy, as well as the American television program, The Daily Show, which would be interesting to know more about that as well. So please give Josh a warm welcome.
Well, thanks for everyone for coming, and to those of you online. So this is the exact moment that I became interested in climate change communication. Okay, I can tell from the room that a few people recognize this. This is Senator Jim Inhofe from Texas in 2015. It was a cold January day in DC, and he went outside, picked up some snow, brought it into the Senate chamber, held up a snowball, and declared that global warming was a lie. And this was a real pivotal moment. There are a lot of memes about it, a lot of people sort of making fun of it, but I actually was quite interested. I've always loved sort of nature, but I wouldn't have previously considered myself a real environmentalist. But this moment got me interested. You know, why can't we even agree that the problem exists, let alone debate the solutions? And hopefully this doesn't get me in trouble, but it reminded me of an incident a few years later. Maybe he was inspired by it. Anyway, so at that time, when I was in DC, I was in DC when this happened. I was working at AAAS. They published the Journal of Science, but they also do a lot of science communication, sort of advocacy for research funding, et cetera, and sort of evidence-based policymaking. Just a little bit about me. I did my undergrad at Hofstra University in New York. It's a liberal arts school outside the city. And while I was an undergrad, interned at The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which I don't know how big it was in Australia, but this was really the launching pad for John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, Samantha Bee, Trevor Noah now. I realized I loved the writing, political writing, but I hated production. It's really quite brutal. I have a lot of respect for people who do it. It wasn't for me. So I headed down to DC to work in politics for a little while, and from there wound up at this AAAS organization. So I was already thinking about climate change communication for a little while after that snowball incident. And I swear this is a true story. I was walking home from work one day, thinking about where I should go to grad school. And I stepped on something sharp, like a nail or something, in the bottom of my shoe. And as I was walking home, it was clicking every time I stepped. And when I got into my apartment, I looked on the bottom of my shoe, and there was an Oxford University pin. Yeah, so you could make what you want about that. So I ended up applying, didn't get in the first time, applied again, and I did an environmental change and management master's course, which I did with share with Lisa, who's invited me to speak today. So this talk is really a whirlwind through a few of my research projects all around climate change communication. And just to tell you a little bit about my master's research, when I was trying to decide what to look at for my MSc dissertation, I came across this article, The Uninhabitable Earth. And this article caused a real sort of controversy because it was one of the most sort of doom and gloom apocalyptic looks at climate change. What is the worst case scenario? Then we had some scientists coming out saying, actually, these doomsday scenarios are as harmful as climate change denial. because they're, scaring people, or in some cases they feel they might not be scientifically accurate. But then we have some other psychologists coming in saying, actually, we can't all be optimistic. We need to, blend in a bit of fear, because this is a real scary situation. And if you look at the research, like some researchers from the University of Queensland found, if you talk a little bit too much about hope, then people might say, oh, everything's going to be fine. Maybe we don't need to worry so much about this. Whereas there's also other research that says, if you talk too much about fear, people are going to shut down. And it just goes back and forth and back and forth. And David Roberts, climate journalist, said at the time quite accurately, the evidence is really mixed. And that was my interpretation as well. But for my master's, I wanted to run my own experiment. And I noticed there was a lack of studies really using video. Most of them use just short text, or even a few using images. And I basically created a few short videos. Everything's the same almost, except you change the tone, you change the wording, right? So, one is sort of empowering. We can do this, we can stop climate change. And the other one is more on that doom and gloom scenario. We're really in trouble. And I showed it to, 500, 600 Americans. And I wanted to explore, I gave away the answer already. I was going to ask you which one you thought was more effective. But in short, I found no significant differences. So these are, it's in a survey, so take that with a grain of salt. But essentially, people who watched a hopeful video or the doom and gloom or control, no significant differences in risk perceptions, likelihood of acting on climate change, likelihood of participating in activism. And I also found a few other things. So this is the 6 Americas of Global Warming. It's a framework that breaks up Americans into groups based on their climate attitudes. And on the left, you have your real activists, and then it's a sort of scale all the way to your active dismissives. And a lot of people are in the middle, though that alarmed and concerned group has grown in recent years. And so you see, in response to these videos, emotional engagement is going down, correlated pretty well with your climate attitudes. And also, if you're climate skeptical, you're going to be a lot more bored watching these videos as well. So just a key thing here, a key lesson is that maybe we shouldn't assume that a single piece of content is going to dramatically change people's minds about this issue. And also not necessarily assume that hope or fear is always going to be better. So it's just trying to urge a little nuance to this argument. But what I'm really here to talk to you about today is my PhD research. And when I was trying to come up with a topic, I kept coming across this term teachable moment. So you often hear this: an extreme weather event occurs, and people say, this is the teachable moment for climate change. So this reflects this idea of psychological distance, that climate change can feel abstract in time and space. There's different scenarios, uncertainties. Whereas it's at least hypothesized that extreme weather can be local. It affects real people, like this couple in the Philippines. The church was destroyed by a typhoon where I think they were supposed to get married. And I think because Peter and Lisa, your wedding was on the day of the fire, with the Canberra fires. Yeah, 20 years ago. Yeah, so we have a real situation in the room showing this. So looking at the research on this, we see this teachable moment term used all the time, both colloquially, but also in the papers. If you're looking in literature, you often come across this term focusing events, and this tends to refer to the policy level. But for my research, I'm really interested in public opinion. And why should we care about public opinion? Well, Abraham Lincoln once put it, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Against it, nothing can succeed. So really important to think about how those public perceptions can influence how society acts on climate change. So, are extreme weather events changing public opinion? Well, it turns out, similar to the hope versus fear debate, that the evidence is mixed. So this was a meta-analysis of over 70 studies, and really we find all sorts of findings. So there are many studies that say, yeah, we show that direct experience of flooding leads to overall increased salience, emotional responses, personal vulnerability to climate change, etc. Yet then we have other studies, same kind of weather event. These are floods in Germany, recent ones. We conclude that it cannot be taken for granted that experiencing extreme weather makes a difference in climate perceptions and policy preferences. And then even yet, we have further studies that say it actually does make a difference, but only for a short while, and then their attention fades. So very mixed findings. Overall, my general impression is that it's generally increasing, at least in the US, the Yale Climate Communication Group. I think they're generally of the opinion that these weather events are driving increased concerns, but the evidence is definitely mixed in more local context. What's really going on here is this idea of motivated reasoning, like this dog wearing goggles. We're all seeing the world through our own lenses of our ideologies and political beliefs. So if you're worried about climate change, you're going to easily make that link when you experience an extreme event or read about it on the news, and vice versa if you're dismissive. But my whole PhD is really taking a different approach. I'm really interested in, do these events raise an opportunity window for communication, for public engagement about climate change? And what are some of the benefits and risks of that strategy? Just to show my supervisors, I have a real hardcore physical scientist, Freddie Otto, and then Pete, who's a knowledge exchange expert, and James, who has a background in journalism and journalism studies now. So for my first study, I really wanted to look at this idea of extreme event attribution. And I assume many of you in this room know about it, but it's basically a new, well, relatively over the last 10, 20 years, a new technique that allows us to quantify how much climate change affected a specific event. And I won't get too much into the technical details, but we can discuss later. But essentially, you arrive at these specific numbers, like this heat wave was made 600 times more likely. There's been very limited, and there's been loads of these studies. This is from Carbon Brief, and they're constantly updating this map. Though it should be pointed out that we have pretty poor observational data for certain weather events, especially across Africa. And so that limits the ability to do these studies, and it's something that researchers are trying to rectify now. So there's been limited research on communication aspects of these kind of findings. The heat wave is made 10 times more likely. And so that's what, for my first PhD study, we wanted to look at. We use focus groups, show people these findings, people who don't have a background in climate science, and say, what do you make of this? And to what extent does this present, are these useful for public engagement? We also showed them different word choices for explaining these links, and also different kinds of visuals. So for these kind of attribution studies, we do find a lot of interest. People are really interested. How does that event relate to climate change that I just experienced, right? And as this person said, if these attribution studies can help answer that, I'm quite interested, right? But there's something novel about that specific number. The heat wave is not just made more likely, it's made 10 times more likely. And it sort of reminds me of, at least in the US, maybe you have them here in Australia as well. We often have commercials on television about, our vacuum cleaner is 10 times more powerful than the other vacuum cleaners. And I think marketers have tapped into this idea of something about, specific numbers and persuasion. There's some theories out there about that. But I think most interest to me was this idea of counterfactuals. So this is actually quite a brief thing. So we explained one of the basic ways of doing attribution is you set up counterfactual models. We model the world as it is today with every change we've made to the atmosphere, and we model it exactly the same, but we take out those emissions, and how did that weather event play out in both those models? People without a background in climate science find that quite interesting, and it makes a lot of sense because we all think in counterfactuals all the time. Imagining, well, what would my life be like if I made a different choice? What would the planet be like if we as a society made different choices? So that's actually a real opportunity for us to engage people. And on the flip side, we only discuss climate change. This was entirely focused on climate signal. And accordingly, when we discuss climate solutions, or at least when focus group participants brought it up, no one talked about anything other than mitigation. No discussion of disaster risk response, land management, emergency communication, adaptation, etc. So we have to be very careful because climate change is only part of that weather risk equation, right? And this is a broader topic, not much time to go into it, but we also found quite a negative response to communicating scientific uncertainty, the sort of band of results around that one number. And that's a classic issue for science communication. Important information to include. How do we do that effectively? Big question in science communication. Yeah. So why am I here in Australia? Well, it was 2020 and I was just beginning, started my PhD in 2019, and the Black Summer bushfires were happening. And like many around the world, I was riveted watching and sort of horrified And I thought, okay, I want to use this as one of my case studies. And of course, this thing happened called the pandemic, and Australia really locked down. So I had to do some of my research online, but I'm really glad that I've made it over here towards the end of my PhD. Now, I just throw up an American flag to say, you know, you are probably, many of you are have much stronger expertise on bushfires than I do. This is one of my case studies. So just pointing out my own cultural bias there. So with the Black Summer bushfires, and actually we looked at a more broader scope of bushfires, we really wanted to look at how this interacts with climate activism. And so we wanted to understand, if you experience a bushfire, if you lose your house or you evacuate or you're a firefighter, does that influence your participation in activism? And there's a lot of literature in psychology about the role of trauma as well, which I'll get to in a moment. But why look at activists? They already care about climate change. Why should we even care about this group? Well, first of all, by speaking with activists, understanding their motivations, it tells us, okay, here are the factors that sort of got these people to be activated on this issue. And that provides insights for us in terms of activating everyone in the middle, or maybe apathetic, or at least they know about it, but not strongly engaged. So it provides insights sort of retrospectively. But among activist groups, they play an important role in pushing for climate action, but there's a lot of burnout, a lot of dropout. It's very hard for these groups to keep people mobilized. And there's an open question, does weather sort of activate people, or does it actually shut people down? And accordingly as well, it's helpful for us to go beyond just public opinion surveys at large, but look at specific groups. So my method was 33 interviews. I really wanted to dig deep with people who are climate activists, but they've also experienced very direct, often quite traumatic experiences of bushfires, and did that during the pandemic online. A few days ago, I got to visit some of the people I interviewed on Kangaroo Island. Actually, I just got back yesterday, and I'm pretty tired from it. But the incredible, beautiful landscape. Have any of you been to Kangaroo Island? Okay, just one. So I've discovered a lot of Australians have not visited Kangaroo Island. Yeah, all tourists. Yeah, well, there weren't too many of us. It was pretty quiet when I was there, at least. But for the beauty of it, I think it's a real underappreciated gem. So this is a picture before the Black Summer bushfires of Flinders Chase National Park. And this is a photo after the Black Summer, and it's just shocking to see this. So the two people I visited there, one of them actually lives right in the national park, and he does a lot of conservation on his own house. And these photos are the trailers, or really the sheds they've been living in for the last, well, one of them, this one was even too small for one of their families, so they actually are renting, not even staying in here. And this is where another couple has been living for the last 2 years, actually, well, since I guess June 2020. And they're finally, well, before I get to what they're doing now, this melted metal, I don't think anyone will guess what this is. This is what is left of 2 motorcycles that were in a shed on one of their properties. And so you can imagine how hot those flames had to be to melt those bikes down. Just a few sort of odds and ends that one of them recovered from her house, and really just devastating stuff. But we're seeing, so what struck me, it's just the regrowth is phenomenal. It's really like, it did look like this on the Flinders Chase National Park property of this landowner. And now this is a photo I took the other day. You do see a lot of fire-loving plants, of yucca, I think that is. And that's actually, I think, growing out of a burnt trunk, which is quite interesting. But yeah, you still see these tall burnt trees, the eucalyptus, but it's really coming back quite quickly, as well as the wildlife, according to them. And this is one of their new houses that they're going to be moving into finally after several years of recovery. So that's just to provide a few insights into the stories a little bit of what's going on there. So how did experiencing a bushfire affect the climate attitudes among these sort of previously environmentally engaged people? Unsurprisingly, no change in their fundamental beliefs. And that really makes a lot of sense. We already believe about climate change. But we do find that people feel more vulnerable now to bushfires and climate change at large. It's transformed from this theoretical issue to a lived experience. And a lot of my interviewees said these kind of things. It's not just theoretical, it's personal, It's happening in my backyard now. A lot of my participants brought up Indigenous Australian fire management techniques. There's a lot of interest in this. I didn't look into it myself too much, at least as part of the study. I didn't feel doing it online over Zoom would do it justice, but it's something I'm growing increasingly interested in. I'm sure many in this room have thought about this as well. And just here are a few, there's a book and a website that might provide further information for those interested. So how did these bushfires affect climate activism, which is really the key question? Well, of the 33 people, we did find that about half of them increased their activism. We found actually 40%, same level, wasn't changed. And 5 of them, small but still, worth looking at, decreased their activism. So let's unpack this a little bit. Fascinatingly, these people who increased their activism, they did so because they wanted to now communicate their experiences. They took on new forms of activism. They started telling their stories, doing media interviews, using it as sort of a tool. They would start their letters to politicians saying, I'm a bushfire survivor, I lost my house. Here's why you need to listen to my views on climate change. We also saw that among firefighters as well. And that's I think worth further study. Something I didn't really dig too deep into, but a lot of dynamics among firefighters, fireys about climate views and to what extent they feel comfortable expressing them among other volunteers and workers. And it's also worth pointing out that emergency, firefighters, emergency rescue kind of teams are seen as very highly trusted communicators. So they're really important for the climate message. Among that group who kept the same level of activism, basically the experiences affirmed what they were already doing. But it's really this last group that raises some interesting questions around trauma. Because among those who actually increased, several of them would say, yeah, if I didn't act on climate change, I would despair. And there's a long history of this in psychology, dating back to a really wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, and lots of studies since then, and from other activist movements like Me Too, this idea that taking action on an issue is a form of therapy. It's a form of way of engaging with trauma and actually reducing it. But on the other hand, among these 5 who decreased, they actually found the trauma so overwhelming that they shut down from climate activism. For some of them, it was, actually just physically they needed to rebuild, but others, and I think for many of them, really, the sort of self-protection, it was too much, too confronting after this really intense experience. So that tells us that trauma and sort of trauma coping mechanisms can go in both ways. And just a few other notes that we also found climate groups played a major role in engaging people about climate change and the link to that to bushfires. A lot of sort of community events held with experts, scientists, and firefighters, creating that kind of dialogue and giving people a chance not only to just engage in activism, but also make sense of their experiences. As I said before, people are interested in understanding that bushfire was, unusual in my mind. Is there a climate signal there? What's going on? And the last thing I will bring up, the last section of my presentation, this idea of dialogue. So as I was doing my literature reviews when I started this PhD, I kept coming across, every time I typed in teachable moments, healthcare research. And at first I would ignore it. I was like, okay, that's just healthcare stuff. And then I started actually looking at it, and I realized there's some interesting parallels here. So among healthcare researchers, they look at this idea that, when someone gets a disease diagnosis, or even a more positive thing, like they become pregnant, or, all kinds of significant life events, it's been found that they can change your sort of behaviors, your health behaviors. So someone gets a disease diagnosis and they quit cigarettes, which flies in the face of traditional conceptions of addiction as this long fought battle, because people will just quit. I don't know if there's an expression in Australia, but cold turkey. Is that expression here? Okay, great. Yeah, American one. Yeah, so there's been a lot of interest among doctors in this. And there's been a movement in recent years among healthcare scientists towards a more proactive communication approach. So when your patient comes in, if you're a doctor and there's complaining of, my fitness is poor, I really want to be able to run or swim better. And then it's an opportunity for the doctor to link that to their behavior. So, oh, you're a smoker. Well, if that's what you care about, you might want to consider trying to reduce your cigarettes. And it's a whole process. I won't go too deep into this, but what we've done is adapt that model, that healthcare communication model for environmental messaging or really environmental dialogue after extreme weather events. We can talk more about this in Q&A, but essentially this draws on a lot of different theories of climate communication, especially the work of Catherine Hayhoe, who's an American climate scientist who does a lot on dialogue models. And essentially the key thing I really want to point out is the starting point. When we talk about climate change and bushfires, we start here, right? We hit them over the head with the facts like, oh, here's how climate change made that bushfire more likely or more intense, or for any kind of weather event. If you're having a conversation with someone, at least the research tells us it's smarter to start with asking questions and starting where they are. What was your experience of that bushfire? What do you care about? You know, what do you think about it? And it's at that point that you find links between what they care about and the science. And by the way, as we pointed out, when you do so, don't only talk about climate change, we have to talk about these broader factors that shape risk as well. And we've injected a lot more of sort of behavioral change theory, you know, again, it's all dialogue steps at each, you know, point. So based on this conversation, you know, what steps might we do to reduce our risk? And that might include, yeah, protecting our homes. Like the guy I met, his house is a lot more fireproof now on Kangaroo Island than before, but also what can policymakers do and how might we as individuals affect those policies? And essentially listening to how they respond to those ideas and trying to make a plan collaboratively. How can we do something about this? So it's learning to action. And last year, a group, myself and a few students started a project called Talk Climate Change around the COP26 conference. And what we wanted to do was sort of operationalize the idea of conversations. I actually pulled it up. So let me see if I can, yeah. So basically, we built a website where anyone can submit a conversation that they have as a form of climate action. We did it for COP26. So Julia spoke with Peter. Peter is her brother, and they spoke in Melbourne about, you know, whatever they wanted about climate change. We're not going to tell you what you have to talk about. And we just wanted to encourage people to do this for COP26. And we received submissions from over 40 countries involving over 1,000 people. And if you go to talkclimatechange.org, you can see what people were talking about. This is Tina. She spoke with her father, Keith, about, yeah, weather events. We saw a lot of those. Joe Biden, bike hire schemes, lots of different stuff around different countries. And it's really quite interesting to see what people were talking about in different places. So that's this idea of really mobilizing climate conversations rather than sort of forcing someone into some kind of action, just open dialogue. Yeah, and we're launching the next phase in a few months that will open this up as a tool for any environmental organization. So, and just in case you're interested, here were the most common conversation topic tags we found from COP26. And we do see a lot of discussion of individual carbon footprint, which is quite interesting because it's something, you know, it's easy to talk about your behaviors, you know, your food, your diet, your transport, etc. So just a few takeaways. So when it comes to communicating climate change, I really have shifted in my mindset myself from this idea of trying to just express this climate bushfire or climate extreme weather link to having a more holistic conversation about risk and what we can do about it. And as part of that, climate science can inform, but it's not the whole story. We need to include it there, but we also need to just paint a broader picture. And lastly, storytelling. So I used it as a research method. I collected stories, and that was also really valuable. And based on that, we found that storytelling is not just a communication tool, but it's also a vital way that people make sense of these extreme weather events, make sense of our lives, and sort of thinking about that, giving people space to engage with what they've experienced. And yeah, feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. And thanks again for the invite.
So thanks everyone for joining us. We'll go to some Q&A. So if there are any questions in the room to just start us off. This microphone is not coming particularly loud, so you will have to speak up.
Thanks for a great presentation. Object there is one teaching research in bushfires and then still here. I do need to do a lesson. I know it's a time, but I think actually maybe at the next hour. I have been at Kangaroo Island. In fact, we supervised the PhD project there, so maybe I can pass on some of that research.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. I'm thinking about teachable moments or periods. Peter Mosky will remember, 15 years ago, so we took a bushfire course here, we turned it into an intensive for a range of reasons, and the only available slot was summer. And it turned out to be a real success because it was like a featured report line. You could, I've often joked with people, you could teach the entire course just by reading the newspapers every day or watching the live bushfire maps and bombing, you know, the fire suppression, fire bomb runs, things like that. And it really had an incredible impact on people. And I would be, you know, really loath to take it to any other time, even though we can't really go out into the field to the fire necessarily for safety reasons like you can with the strike burn. So that's I can really understand that kind of teaching period and the impact that it has. And so of course, it's running on the Black Saturday fires, well, in 2009, the Canberra fires in 2003, and the Black Summer fires more recently. The other thing that struck me with that is students in the course come in that have experienced those events, and they're coming years later, and it's clearly had an impact on them. And they teach into our course from their experiences. So my question, my long-winded question to you is, what's the sort of longevity of this moment? How long does it last, and what's the potential dynamic of the effect that it has on individuals? Do you have any insight?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really interesting. I'll have to ask you more about that course, and that's really quite interesting that you're, you know, if it coincided with these events, that kind of really makes it quite salient.
We seem to have a major bushfire event right on the weekend, right in the middle of the course.
Yeah.
Including the 500 people.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, your question is the right question, and it's that longevity question. It's thinking about, you know, timing. Yeah, unfortunately, it's one of the toughest questions to answer from a research perspective. And
sorry.
Well, maybe it's my postdoc, I don't know, but you know, maybe I'll revisit these interviews in a year or a few years. I've seen various dates, if we want to get specific. Some point to 1 year from a disaster's anniversary as sort of the time span. But then we often see, as I've given this talk in different places in Australia, the question I've been getting is, well, what if it's too soon to talk about climate change? And that to me, in my opinion, is really a political statement. It's not an evidence-based statement that's trying to deter climate action. And no one's saying that as a helicopter is landing on a roof to rescue someone, they'd say, oh, did you see this report from ANU about climate change and bushfires? There's no reason that talking about climate change interferes with saving lives and communities. So there's questions of how soon is it, but also how long is that opportunity window? And there's no clear evidence-based answers yet.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
There's questions online.
Thank you, Dr. Very interesting. Many sort of points of reference. I think I've got sort of an observation and then a question. Peter can ask you for those online. The observation is just thinking a bit, continuing from Jeff's comment in the bushfire inquiry 20 years ago. One of the phenomena that we observed was that awareness of events, catastrophic events, follows a fairly predictable cycle of heightened awareness, you know, around the event and the recovery phase, and then, you know, both in policy terms, but also in community memory terms, phase. And we're seeing that in Canberra at the moment. I went to visit a builder this morning who told me, I recognise you. I saw you on TV talking about the western edge of Canberra and the fire risk. And, you know, we've now got the ACT government allowing developers to build houses up against the western edge of Canberra in new developments, when 20 years ago, the number of reports of the 2003 fire said don't do that. And, you know, the sort of conjunction of political, what's the right word? Political focus on other issues and loss of community memory, and the opportunity to make money from selling that land is too much and has overwhelmed, you know, what we know about fire behaviour and fire impacts on communities. So I think I guess I was thinking about that sort of phenomenon in some when you were reflecting your results. I guess my question is, for your analytical framework, or action framework, might be better way. It's interesting. Just a more general question, you know, the sort of question that PhD supervisors ask. How does the study that you talked about in Kangaroo Island fit into the other work you're doing in your PhD, and where does that take, you know, the outcomes of your PhD? There's another slide or two there somewhere that I'm just to learn about it.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I'm interested to hear more about that from you. And it's sort of, there's a term I've come across called sort of the half-life of disaster. And there is a real desire to move on from these as well, which can limit action. Basically, in terms of my PhD, it's all sort of different angles of this idea. Is there an opportunity window when these events occurs for public engagement? Now, yes, that bushfire study I've done is a lot of psychology in there, but the key takeaway was that, and maybe I need to add this to my presentation, to be honest, because people are quite traumatized and with these different trauma coping mechanisms, for some people, engaging them about climate action will be not only good for climate action, but also personally psychologically beneficial. But for others, it might be actually actively harmful. So it tells us as environmental communicators that we do have to be sensitive. We have to be careful, and sort of that's why I think the dialogue approach is a bit safer, because you can say, how comfortable are you to talk about this? Maybe we can engage. And if they say no, then you can,
Yeah, well, you could use Victor, our former Prime Minister, in a different context, in a famous event associated with the Black Saturday fires, would illustrate that point, I think.
yeah.
Where he was trying to shake people's hands, and they weren't willing to have their hands shaken.
Exactly, because it was perceived as sort of using it for politics rather than genuine concern or something like that.
That would be part of it, I think. And also the particular moment he had been overseas on holiday and kept that secret from people, and then sort of popped back up to sort of do the glad handing. Anyway,
Yeah, well, I don't have it in the presentation, but I do have some choice quotes about anger.
Sure. Well, Scott Morrison's a great focus to give.
No, thanks.
We'll go to a question online. This is from Claire Inwood. Hi, Josh. Claire from a local government in Southeast Queensland here. Can you speak briefly to the demographic makeup of your 33 interviewees? I'm particularly interested whether you can speak with, if you spoke with people with additional communication needs in the sample, for example, deaf or blind or English as a subsequent language.
Yeah, good question. I don't have the table of the demographics here, but a majority of them were from Victoria and New South Wales. Quite a range in age and educational background. In terms of disabilities, we sort of gave different options. There were one or two who preferred to use audio only for various reasons. We didn't sort of ask why. But yeah, it's a good question always with that sort of communication accessibility. To be honest, and it was really quite tough from the UK, trying to get my sample going. I kind of wish I could have, if I'd been here, it might have been a bit more holistic and diverse, especially in trying to speak with Indigenous Australian people as well. But it's something I might follow up on now.
Any other questions in the room? There's two at the back here.
I was just wondering, in your experience of the reason what role has an individual's belief in religion or the greater meaning being in the closet was panicking, across, and how do you, I guess, seem overcoming that, or how do you stick messaging through the closet?
Yeah, so overlaps between sort of climate beliefs and faith, and yeah, there's a lot of research on that as well. And it's in my sample, we found a lot of what would be called nature connectedness, sort of a feeling of spirituality with the land. At least this is a qualitative study. It's 33 people. It's not that generalizable, but it's for depth and understanding different pathways. But there is a lot of research out there on the ideas of faith. The woman I mentioned before, the climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe from the US, she's an evangelical Christian. And she has made a lot of headway in sort of engaging her religious community through their religious values on climate change. And there's loads of examples worldwide like that as well. But good question.
It is yours.
Yeah.
Next to your soup that you just gone very rapidly write down notes and stuff like that. We're going to shut up as you talk more super cool. Two quick questions from me, one sort of longer, to kind of extend beyond my chats. Oh, okay. You know, sure, it's not a question. The quick one is the last chapter you showed with the health model that we're thinking is that going to be published chapters.
Yeah, it's under review, and we'll see what the reviewers say.
Okay, pretty good. And the other question was, in your interviews, we're chatting to people who experience bushfires and also were engaging in climate activism, right? So my sort of unfair question is, do you have any like insights maybe or ideas on what might be the case of people that have experienced bushfire that may not have been engaging more in climate activism? Do you think those teachable moments and that experience prompts behavior from those folks as well as more of that traumatizing effect that we found?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And we did look in our sample. It just so happened that our sample was composed of entirely people who had previously participated. We didn't have any instances of people who had never participated in climate activism, had the bushfire experience, and then for the first time. So this is really a study of sustained climate activism, but I also have yet to see too many studies focused on that individual level. There is a good study from Hilary Boudet and colleagues in Nature looking at sort of community activism, and they found quite mixed results around the US, at least to what extent that happened for the first time.
We've got a question from Sarah. Hi Josh, thanks for the great presentation. I'd be interested if participants found it difficult to know what to do in terms of activism. Did they know who and what to target? And did that change after things such as bushfires?
Brilliant question. And it's a great question because this is sort of one of the key findings, right? Climate groups, they do play a major sort of facilitating role, both as what's sometimes called alternate scientific communicators. So like sort of taking the science and using it in that kind of context, but also mobilizing people. One of the groups I work quite a bit with is Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action. And that's literally what they do. They try to provide a base of support for people who are, really quite traumatized by their experiences and give them opportunities to engage, whether it's telling their story to media, writing in letters to policymakers, et cetera. So yeah, these groups play a major role in facilitating that move to sort of activate people based on their experiences.